afternoon, Cathedral community. Those of you here and those of you joining us online on this day that we remember and are inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. As we gather here today, we ask the question, where do we come from here? And as we ask that question, we are guided by the wisdom of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said nearly 60 years ago that if we are to pose that question, and he put it this way, he said, before we can answer the question of where we go from here, we must first honestly recognize where we are now. And so, the same is true of us today. Before we can chart a course forward, we must confront our present reality. We must confront our now. And as we do that, there is no denying it. We are living in despairing times. When I watched footage several months ago of the ICE enforcement raid on an apartment complex in Chicago, an operation chillingly named Operation Midway Blitz, where families, many with young children, were dragged from their homes at dawn, their faces pressed to the ground, I was horrified. I wondered, how have we come to treat human beings like this? How have we normalized cruelty? My horror was only deepened as I watched the video of an ICE agent fatally shooting Renee Nicole Good as if her life were collateral damage in a wider political struggle. She was a mother. She was a wife. She was a daughter. She was a sacred child of God's. How does it become acceptable to violate any of those things? I wondered, how is it that a sacred human life has become so expendable? How does this staggering lack of reverence for human beings become acceptable on any level for any reason? And so it is that this is a despairing time. And so in this time of despair, when the fatal and dehumanizing become normalized, when false and divisive narratives take root, and as public discourse grows increasingly crass and dishonorable, even and especially from the highest office in the land, it is now in such a time as this that we must ask, where do we go from here? Now make no mistake about it. These are despairing times. And yet, we cannot afford to despair. For here's the thing about despair, perhaps even more than fear. Despair is the soil in which oppressive and authoritarian regimes take root and thrive. Despair, you see, paralyzes. It convinces us that nothing will ever change, and before we know it, we begin to compromise, to comply, and to concede. We settle for silence. We go along to get along, and slowly we lose sight of our own values. We lose sight of our own moral bearings, even losing sight of who and whose we are. It is no accident that despair is being cultivated in this our time through relentless untruths, ceaseless distractions, calculated chaos, and deliberate scapegoating. We are worn down and told that our protest is foolish and futile, that it's unpatriotic and even seditious. We are told implicitly and explicitly that silence is safer, that compliance is wisdom, that nothing we do matters. And yet, precisely because we are living in such despairing times, this moment demands something of us. It demands that we move forward. This moment requires something of us as individuals, as people of faith, as children of God, of those who would dare carry forth the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so we must ask with urgency and honesty, what are we to learn from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as we ask this question, where do we go from here? Interestingly enough, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke into a moment not unlike our own. Standing at the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, he declared this. He said, "We have come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. Now is the time," he said, "to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time," he said, "to lift our nation from the quicksand of racial injustice. Now is the time," he said, "to make justice a reality for all God's children." 4 years later, from the pulpit of Riverside Church, 1 year to the day before his assassination, King returned to that same insistence. In denouncing the Vietnam War, he said, "We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now." And so here we are, some 60-odd years later, confronted with our own fierce urgency of now. And it is with that urgency that again we must ask, where do we go from here? And so, what is it that we are to learn from King? What are the lessons he teaches us as we contemplate this very question of where we go from here? I think that there are 3 eternal truths, if you will, that help us to answer that question as we learn from King. First, King teaches us that we have a duty to be free. King put it this way. He said, we have a duty to be free. God doesn't want anybody to feel inferior, he said. Neither does God want anybody to feel superior. We have a duty to ourselves and before Almighty God, King said, to stand up for our freedom. What we learn from King is that freedom is a sacred trust. And that trust, my friends, is betrayed whenever laws, policies, or institutions elevate some by dehumanizing others. Today, it is betrayed whenever whiteness is privileged. It is betrayed whenever immigrant lives are treated as disposable. It is betrayed when human lives are arranged into a hierarchy of value and worth. Any system that teaches some they are less than or others that they are more than, any system that does that violates both human dignity and divine creation, and thus the sacred trust that is freedom. In this regard, freedom is not an abstract principle to be debated. It is not merely a political status, a legal arrangement, or a constitutional right. Rather, it cuts to the core of our humanity, to the core of our sacred being. It reflects the freedom of God and the inalienable freedom of God's people, and that means every single person that has breath. And so to be free, To be free, as King understood it, is to free ourselves from the webs of unfreedom, even when we may benefit from them. Freedom means, therefore, refusing the false wages, that is, privileges of superiority that oppressed systems and unjust systems offer. It means to live as though every human being is created for freedom, because they are, and to fight for that freedom whenever and wherever it is threatened. Simply put, to remember the lessons King is teaching us rightly is to refuse illusions of freedom and to stand again and again and again for the sacred humanity and thus the freedom of all. And so, what do we learn from King as we go forward? In these our despairing times, we learn from him that we have a duty to be free. Second, King teaches us, as you've heard, to confront the triple evils of violence. King was unflinching in naming what he called the triple evils of racism, classism, and militarism. He warned by saying this. He said, "We must come to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together." His insight was prophetic and painfully relevant today. In a time such as now, when our government has sought permission to deny food assistance to millions, when our government undermines access to health care and simultaneously increases military budgets and expands a paramilitary force in the name of security, King's words confront us as never before. The dehumanization of immigrants, the abandonment of the poor, and the normalization of state violence domestically and abroad are not separate issues. They are deeply intertwined. This is why King called for nonviolence, not as passivity or simply as momentary protest, but rather as sustained and radical resistance to all forms of violence. Violence for King, my friends, was anything that devalues the life God has given. Bigotry is violence. Poverty is violence. Militarism is violence. To go forward from here is to commit ourselves to dismantling these forms of violence structurally, culturally, and spiritually. And to do so requires sustained resistance, determined courage, and a transformation of our collective will until every single human life is safe from the violence of injustice. As King reminded us, true peace is not the absence of tension. It is the presence of justice. God's peace, my friends, is not merely the end of war. It is the fostering of a society where all people are treated justly, and so not able to just survive, but also to flourish. So where do we go from here? We go forward by committing ourselves to dismantling the triple evils of violence. And finally, King calls us to trust and to labor along the moral arc of the universe. King famously said, borrowing from the words of Theodore Parker, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That arc, however, does not bend on its own. For its promise of justice does not matter to our earthly now if we refuse to place ourselves on the ark. And this much we know to be true. We are living in nothing less than a morally fraught time. What is often described as a dark moment in our nation's history. It is a moment marked by moral compromise, if not outright moral disregard. It is a time in which harmful beliefs are normalized, false narratives gain traction, and the foundations of a moral, democratic life feel increasingly fragile. But most troubling, this moral crisis erodes our very moral imagination. That is, the capacity to envision and pursue a just and equitable future, what King described as a beloved community. In such a landscape, morality is often reduced to a form of moral narcissism, one that sustains white supremacy by grounding power in self-justifying claims of righteousness or personal virtue. When our leadership proclaims that power is governed by, and I quote, my own morality, morality itself is weaponized and becomes an instrument of domination rather than a guide toward justice. To recognize that the arc of the universe bends toward justice is to get on that arc, which means being called to nothing less than a moral reckoning. A moral reckoning not only with the injustices we inherit, but a moral reckoning with the moral indifference and apathy that allows those injustices to persist. To counter our fraught moral present, we must cultivate a collective moral imagination. Again, a collective capacity to see beyond what is and to aspire toward what could be. And to believe in what could be is not naive, but rather it is the very foundation for the urgent work of our now. In this sense, claiming our moral imagination, I promise you, is not an abstract hope. No, it is a way of being in the world. It is the daily, deliberate choice of each of us to align our lives, to align our politics, to align our practices with the justice toward which that moral arc bends. James Baldwin put it this way. He said, "We made the world we're living in, and we have to make it over." The lesson we learn from King is that if we are going to move forward from here, we must do the moral work of making it over. And so, there you have it. What are we to learn from King on this day as we ask the question, where do we go from here? We are to learn that in going forward from here, we must do so with an enduring commitment to freedom, to justice, and to moral responsibility. And yet, here's the thing. With that said, and as important as all three of those things are, there's something else about King that struck me as I contemplated this question. And that is who he was, his very humanness. When King stepped into history, he was only 26 years old. When he was assassinated, he was only 39. We often forget how young he was. We often place him beyond imitation, if you will, as though he were extraordinary in ways inaccessible to us. And perhaps he was extraordinary, but he was also an ordinary human being. An ordinary human being who chose again and again and again to step into history, to step in to the urgency of his now. History, I once told my son, is the story we write with our lives. It is not only what happened, it is what we do with the time we are given. King warned us. Tomorrow is today, he said. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. There is, he said, such a time as being too late. He cautioned that history remembers and those who wield power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. He said it consigns them to the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time. And so, today, as we gather to remember King, it is left for each of us to decide how we want to step into history. It is left for us to decide whether we will step in, accepting responsibility for our moment by confronting webs of unfreedom, refusing neutrality in the face of the triple evils, and acting as moral agents in the long struggle for justice. And so back to the beginning. We are living in despairing times. And so it is that this is the time for us to live free. This is the time for us to break the silence. This is the time for us to live our values out loud. This is the time for us to refuse despair. When our days become dreary, with low hovering clouds of despair, King said, let us remember that there is a creative force in this universe working to pull down the gigantic mountains of evil, to make a way out of no way, and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. And so, Cathedral community, as we go forward from here, from this Cathedral Church today, let us go forward with a fierce commitment to partner with that creative force, refusing to let despair or evil have the last word. And to live, let us go forward committed to live with the urgency of now, as if a better world is possible. Because guess what? It is. And so may it be so now. Amen.